Today on Young Heretics, I begin with a question for you. What do you honor most? That is what this episode is all about. It's about honor, which is a topic that we don't really know even how to start talking about anymore. It's one of the most lost subjects in public discourse. And I'm going to talk about honor by talking about the honor of one man, which is the Roman soldier Horatius Cocles, or Horatius Cocles. But more generally, speaking of honor in general terms, I want to make a crucially important point that I don't think has really been recalled successfully in modernity. That point is you are what you honor. And that's true in two ways. First of all, what you as a person honor is what you will strive to be and what you will strive to become. And what a society honors is what its citizens will strive to become. Because being human beings, we all are social animals. We have political impulses, that is, in the original Greek sense of politike, we have impulses to live together in structured relationship with one another. And what we honor collectively as a society is what people in the aggregate will seek to be. And that goes in two different directions. So if a society has awards and honors afforded to patriotism, if it is an honorable thing to achieve success for the glory of your country and to make great art that celebrates your country, then you will get a lot of patriotic art. And the most talented and meritorious people will funnel their talents and energies in that direction, and that will thrive. If you celebrate dishonesty, if you celebrate conformity, if you celebrate lying, then you will create a nation of liars and cowards because, it's true, of course, that people can, espouse value systems that are countercultural, that go against the sociological, honor systems that they live within. That's perfectly true. But by and large, it is a fact of human nature that what a society honors is what its population becomes. And it's the flip side of something that we talked about when we talked about Aristotle and the Nicomachean Ethics. In Aristotle's Ethics, part of the purity of doing good things is doing them for their own sake. That true virtue consists in choosing the good because it is good. And that is true. And certainly the height of virtue is that, and in some senses, the greatest proving ground of virtue is when everybody else is doing something that you believe to be evil and you choose the good. Absolutely. But you know what? Men ain't angels, as our founders, to paraphrase the founders of America. And the simple fact of the matter is that human nature is a reality, and it is messy and complicated and social. This is something that is acknowledged, actually, interestingly, in the Bible. If you read the opening chapter of Proverbs, which is the great book of wisdom of Solomon, the first chapter is just all like, don't hang out with schlubs. Like, don't hang out with bad people because they will set the parameters of what you wish to do, and they will turn you down an evil path. In some sense, it's a very basic thing, but as I think we'll see, once you sort of really dig into how it works on a larger sociological level, it's everything. Now, there's an important point I want to make about honor, because when I start to talk about honoring things and wanting to do stuff to be honored, the immediate reaction is, I don't really think that that's very virtuous because it's kind of inauthentic. It doesn't represent really me. It doesn't come spontaneously from the inside out. Well, I think that this is a very, very wrong way. One of the fundamentally wrong ways that we in modernity tend to view who we are as human beings and how we operate. One of the key ways that this occurs is gender. People say, oh, well, gender is just a construct. Gender is just, boys aren't born playing football. They're not born shooting guns. Girls aren't born, wearing dresses. And that's perfectly true. And there is, some innate reality of ourselves that, we do try to understand what what our impulses are. But our impulses are not the whole of us. They're conflicting a lot of the times. And, essential to us is our sociability and our aspiration. You are what you aspire to. Your aspirations are natural. They're part of your humanity. And so, yes, boys aren't born with guns in their hands, but they do aspire to strength. This is something that you can observe at a population level. In the aggregate, boys tend to feel that tug of the heart in the direction of strength in the service of nobility. And honor is one of the key social ways that we encourage our best aspirations, or indeed our worst aspirations. Why is this? Well, it's because of what honor essentially is. In a public sense, public honors are outward recognitions of some inward virtue. So look, if it were the case that people were perfect, every public honor would attach perfectly to some real virtue. Every title of nobility would attach to somebody that was actually noble and generous and magnanimous. Every condemnation, every public condemnation would attach to somebody that was evil and vicious. However, we are flawed and lies exist. It's perfectly possible for honors to be dishonest. The Oscars are a great example of this. They're purely political at this point. They are honors that represent something that is not true about the movies that they are being awarded to. But the purpose of an honor, just like the purpose of a word, is to be a symbol that represents some inner reality, and you can lie with words or you can tell the truth with words. The purpose of an honor is to represent visually or in some public way, some tangible way, an inner nobility and an inner virtue, which, you can be honest with honors and you can be dishonest with honors. It's not unlike what Catholics say, actually, about church sacraments. And now sacraments are church rituals like marriage, baptism, these rituals that mark central moments in a Christian's life. And there are, a countable number of them. There are 7 of them in the Catholic Church. They are baptism, confirmation, Eucharist, that is communion, penance, the anointing of the sick, the taking of holy orders, and matrimony, the sacred ceremony of joining man and wife. That's how the Catholic Church, enumerates its sacraments, and there are other, versions of this. There are other churches that only recognize a limited number of sacraments. But the philosophy of the sacrament is something that, goes back to Augustine in the 4th century AD, his text on the catechizing of the uninstructed. And then it's picked up by this Italian theologian who works in Paris during the 12th century. In his Book of Sentences, he writes that sacraments are an outward sign of an inward grace. And this is this beautiful idea that has been carried down through the centuries by Catholics, that when you do a ceremony, a ritual, like take marriage, right? When you put a ring on somebody's finger, when you say certain words, it's these tangible, visible, sensible things, or pouring water on somebody's head at baptism, right? This thing you can feel and touch, which is a representation of an inner, invisible, intangible spiritual reality, the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, or the joining of 2 people together as one flesh. A sacrament is the tangible outward expression of that intangible reality, just like a word is an audible expression of something that maybe doesn't have a sound, or maybe doesn't even have anything. Like the word love is a physical thing that I do. I make that sound with my mouth, and inwardly you grasp that inner reality. Now, in sacraments, the Church believes that the outward sign and the inward sign are one and the same, that when baptism happens, that is when the Holy Spirit, cleanses you of sin, and so forth. There are plenty of Christians, myself among them, who see this sacramental structure built into the entire world. And there are, passages that people tend to point to in the Bible, like Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God. This idea that creation itself is structured sacramentally. So all of the material world, everything around us, the sky, the trees, the natural world, but also the way that we interact with each other, all of this is sacramental in the sense that it is matter, physical stuff that you can see and touch, which expresses and enacts something deeper, something intangible, the things of God, right? No one has ever seen God, but we have seen our brother. And loving our brother is part of how we enter into the intangible, the transcendent, the beyond all speech and thought love of God. Well, where do we get this? In part, we get it from John 1, the Gospel of John chapter 1, right? That through him were made all things that were made, and all of creation on some profound level is a sacrament. Why is it, therefore, that we speak of Jesus, the incarnation, as the Word of God, right? Because when I talk about language being a key instance of this phenomenon, this representational phenomenon, it's because Jesus is kind of in miniature, shrunk down into this human level, a distillation of that huge universal thing, which is the sacramental creation. It's fundamental to what we are as people, and it is what creation is. It's, in some sense, it's at the heart of everything, right? It is at the heart of the Trinity, right? That the Word of God was with God from the beginning and was constantly poured forth and is eternally and will be eternally. Honor is one of the central human versions of this. So it's not artificial. It's not extrinsic to who we are. It's part of who we are. It's how we give outward signs of inward virtue. And so it is actually closer to the Aristotelian ethics idea than you might initially think, although with the key caveat that what you have to do in a society and in a relationship is you have to take honor and put it honestly onto the thing that it is supposed to represent, and that is virtue. This is crucial, right? Because remember from Aristotle again that virtue is what it means to be good at being human. And so honor in a society is what it means to be good at being a human society, right? It's essential to the fullest flourishing of who we are and what we are. Let us get into the story of Horatius Cocles as a way of illustrating all of this. But first, thank you for being here. It is a pleasure to have you here. I love talking about this stuff. Today, I am sipping happily on a glass of whiskey, which I got into sipping whiskey on this show when we did the Maltese Falcon. This is Ardbeg, the Wee Beastie. It's a very young 5-year-old whiskey for those that like scotches from Islay, which is my favorite region to drink whiskey from. Thank you for joining me for this episode. If you have not already, please subscribe to the show. We love to have you along for this ride, and you will get new episodes easier each week if you hit subscribe wherever you're currently viewing or listening to this podcast, or wherever else you get your podcast. So YouTube, iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, all these places to subscribe. You'll get a weekly episode. And do me a solid and go to iTunes and rate this podcast 5 stars. Because if you like this show, that is one of the key ways that you can contribute to it and help support our work on Young Heretics. Tell people about it. Tell your friends. Tell your kids. Tell your wife. But most of all, give us a 5-star review. All right. Thanks for being here. Cheers. Let's talk about honor. The Romans, the ancient Romans, were masters of honor. I believe that the ancient Roman republican society is the exemplary instance of how to do honors in public in a civilization. Honor itself is a Roman word, and that doesn't mean that there is no such thing as honor. Obviously, in pre-Roman societies, all human societies have honors, but it does mean that our understanding of honor and our use of honor is fundamentally shaped by this Roman concept. So it's a Latin word, comes to us through Middle English. And remember that Middle English, after 1066, the Battle of Hastings, when the Normans start conquering the English Isles, this is when Middle English starts to incorporate, layering on top of the Germanic Anglo-Saxon, all of these French, French words which have Latin roots. So we get this word. The Latin word is onos, H-O-N-O-S, and then in the genitive, that is the sort of possessive form, it's honoris, which is where we get honor. And that's, glory, reward. It's very, these things begin as very tangible concepts and they get abstracted out in many cases. And then, in Old French, we have honor, honoré. So the people who understood this best were the Romans. The writer who maybe understood it best of all was Polybius. And we have mentioned Polybius on this show before, but this is going to be our first foray really into his work. Himself, he was a Greek. He was not a Roman, although he was fascinated by Rome and spent time among the Romans. He was a military leader, and he was part of this pretty powerful political family in what was called the Achaean League. And we've talked about these federal organizations of Greek city-states before. This is a federal organization of southern Greeks. Around 200 BC, Polybius is born. So this is later than some of the developments we've talked about before in Greece, like the Peloponnesian War and the High Classical period. We're getting on into what you would call the Hellenistic period, which begins after the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC. So Polybius is born in around 200. His dad, Lycortas, was the general of the league. That's the annually elected leader, several times in the 180s BC. And in Polybius' lifetime, Greece itself and all of the Mediterranean would eventually bend the knee to Rome, would submit to Roman rule. This was a shocking, world-altering turn of events. And so Polybius lived in a pivotal moment in history because, look, the Romans, as we've discussed, when we talked about Aeneas, they start out as these kind of farmer settlers. They very quickly make their name as a warlike people in Italy, but they've expanded their power at this point out throughout Italy, and they suddenly become tested by this conflict with a seafaring empire, and they are land warriors. They ride on horses and they fight on foot, and suddenly they come up against Carthage in North Africa, which is a major empire. This is sort of shortly before Polybius is born. It's called the First Punic War, Punic meaning Carthaginian, in 264 to 241 BC. So a fairly lengthy war, and they're fighting over control of Sicily, which, if you're looking at a map, that's the soccer ball that the Italian boot is kicking. It's this island, and North Africa and Italy are kind of grappling for control over it. There follows the Second Punic War, 218 to 201, against Hannibal, the great general after whom Hannibal Lecter in Silence of the Lambs is named. They themselves, the Romans, suffered this terrible defeat in 216 at Cannae, but then they come back and they win a crushing victory at Zama in 202. And this, you may recall from when we talked about the Gracchi, right? This is Scipio Africanus is the victor, and his son-in-law is Tiberius Gracchus. So there's that connection there to catch you up if you listened to those episodes. Once Zama happens, and once Rome kind of throws together a navy and does this incredible act of triumph over Carthage, Rome begins to come into its own and develop an appetite for outward expansion in a bigger way, perhaps, than ever it had before. So the next thing that happens is they turn out towards these Macedonian empires, and these guys were left behind when Alexander the Great died, 323 BC. Philip of Macedon in 197 and Antiochus III of the Seleucids in 189 are these two big Macedonian leaders that get conquered by the Greeks. So all of Alexander's leftover territory is getting gobbled up by the Romans, and the Greeks, as they had once before, as the Persians began to expand, the Greeks begin to get a little worried. And rightly so. I mean, there's really two options now. You either just, prophylactically submit to Rome, sort of preemptive submission, or you try to navigate maintaining independence. And there are two kind of schools of thought about this in the Achaean League, in Polybius' day. The Polybius' archenemy, Callicrates, is a proponent of submission to Rome. He's like, let's be on Rome's side. They're the big dogs. Let's follow them. Polybius is a little more cagey, a little more feisty. And Rome, at this point itself, is on the warpath. They're against Perseus of Macedon, which is, after Philip, he's kind of the next person they want to beat. And Rome, in this context, when they were at war, they were ruthless. You're either for us or you're against us. You're our pals, or we will crush you just like everybody else. That's when they're at war. At peace, it's a little bit different. But at war, they're going to take you on, or you're going to be on their side. So finally, in 169, Polybius himself leads an embassy to the Roman ambassador, Gaius Popilius Linus. But at this point, it's kind of too late. They've already been too visibly lukewarm. It's the third year of the war already, and the Achaeans have been sort of portrayed as insufficiently supportive, and this is bad news. So Perseus gets defeated, Battle of Pydna, 168. Rome cleans house. So they deport just masses of their enemies. Anybody that didn't stand with them is up on the chopping block. They're selling people into slavery. They're deporting a lot of folks. And in Greece, Callicrates, being the kind of like buddy-buddy of Rome, gets to make a list of his enemies, just like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez wishes that she could make a list of Trump supporters. Callicrates gets to make a list. And this is why I say when people start making lists of bad people, it is bad news. You do not want this. It is a very, very violent, inherently violent thing to do. 1,000 Achaeans were deported, including Polybius, who was deported to Rome. Now, we've talked before about exile. It's on the one hand, it's viewed as this very painful and agonizing thing. On the other hand, it's often the making of many great authors. It was sort of the literary making of Machiavelli, despite how much he hated it in some regards. And for Polybius, this is when he sets about writing his histories. And the point of his histories is to explain what the hell just happened. Because suddenly this group of farmers from huts has taken over the entire world, and the Mediterranean itself has become one province. It's become all under, to varying degrees, under the sway of this sudden new power. For Polybius, that's the point of writing history, is to understand the shape of world events and to participate in them, as he himself had done. I am going to read now the opening of his histories, in which he explains himself a little bit more about this. So here's book 1, chapter 1 of Polybius' Histories, and I am reading here from the Oxford World's Classics by Robin Waterfield. If you remember when we did the symposium, we also read Waterfield's translation of that. I really like his work, and I recommend this edition if you're reading Polybius. There is no more authentic way to prepare and train oneself for political life than by studying history. But also, there is no more comprehensible and comprehensive teacher of the ability to endure with courage the vicissitudes of fortune, something of which Polybius himself was speaking from experience, than a record of others' catastrophes. Obviously, then, the general principle that no one should feel obliged to repeat what has often been well said before is particularly pertinent in my case. He's saying, at the very beginning, he says plenty of people have extolled the virtues of history. For the extraordinary nature of the events I decided to write about is in itself enough to interest everyone, young or old, in my work and make them want to read it. After all, is there anyone on earth who is so narrow-minded or uninquisitive that he could fail to want to know how, and thanks to what kind of political system, almost the entire known world was conquered and brought under a single empire, the empire of the Romans, in less than 53 years, an unprecedented event? Or, again, is there anyone who is so passionately attached to some other marvel or matter that he should consider it more important than knowing about this? And he goes on eventually to say, this is, an interlocking series of events that can be viewed in the aggregate and understood as this seismic change in world history. He believes in the, he is fairly rationalist in his approach, and he believes, that although fortune, can interrupt the natural progression of events as we understand it, nevertheless, there is a comprehensible order to the chain of causation. And, it's his job, he thinks, to explain how this huge change in world affairs has come about. There is no more important job for the historian, and he's going to do it. So he sets out, explain what made Rome great between the years of 220 to 167. And then, in the middle of writing it, he revises and he extends down to 146 BC, which is when Rome decisively destroyed both Carthage in the Third Punic War under Scipio Aemilianus and Corinth under Lucius Mummius Achaeus. He wrote 40 books of this history. Only the first 5 of them survive complete, and then there are fragments of others. So one of the, as we've talked about before, there are tragic losses in the history of ancient texts. This is one of them. We would love to have more. That's what we got. Even in that, we have remarkable wisdom and insight. The most important book for us today, because remember we're talking about honor here, right? The most important book for us is book 6, in which Polybius describes at great length the constitution of Rome itself. Now, remember in that passage I first read, he says that it's how and according to what system of government Rome was able to become so successful so quickly. Let's read why, in his view. So, in essence, in this book, what Polybius does is gives us our fullest account of something we've talked about many times on this show, and that is the cycle of regimes. So, I've used the word anacyclosis to talk about it, right? And there are strands of this that come to us from Herodotus and from Aristotle, but it really gets kind of tied into one account in Polybius Book 6. So the basic idea is 3 kinds of government with good and bad forms. These are the basic forms of government. You have monarchy, kingship, which is good when you have a virtuous king, and evil when it becomes tyranny, when the sons of the king become vicious and entitled. You have then once that happens, you get a sort of uprising of the best men, and those men seize power and they form an aristocracy. The aristocracy devolves into cronyism. Cronyism, which I think is kind of where we're at in many ways, this just elite that's not there because they're the best, they're just there, and they're helping their friends, and Gavin Newsom is eating at, a fancy French restaurant while he orders everybody to stay inside after 10 p.m., like just that kind of thing, right? So that's oligarchy. Then you have this kind of overtaking by the people, and the people institute democracy, but democracy devolves eventually into mob rule, or ochlocracy. The ochlos in Greek is the mob. And then from there you have a strong man who sort of comes and wrestles his way to the top. You're back at kingship. Now, this is an account based on the inherent instability of simple forms of government, of just one way of ruling people. Each one has its pluses and minuses, and the minuses eventually kind of decay their way into degradation, and then you kind of like you have this reassessment, and the cycle sort of continues and goes on. Polybius thinks that there is another thing. He thinks that that's not the full account, but that there's this special other form of government, the mixed regime, which is basically a perpetual motion machine that uses the decay and the success and the difficulties of each different form of government balanced against one another, and that is the republic. It's what we have in America, and that's foundationally expressed in our founding documents, that's how this whole thing works. And Polybius is not the only person to talk about it. Cicero talks about it at length, but this idea that the cycle of regimes is supposed to be kind of held in this in this suspended animation by the dynamism internal to a republic is a remarkable kind of act of political philosophy on Polybius' part. And Polybius uses Sparta as he says, Sparta is a great example, but Rome is the best. It balances all these different kinds of government against one another, and the people, the elites, and the leaders are kind of in this constant back and forth that allows them to live together in a successful and even valorous way. Fundamental to this is what we would now call checks and balances. And he, after he's described, the people and the sort of patricians in the Senate, and then the consuls, who are the sort of kingly element of the Roman regime, he says fundamental to this is, the different ways in which each one has power over the other. And it's in section 15 that he begins to explain this. And his account of what gives the people power is in section 14, and that is really what we want to focus on here. Because, look, of course you can see how a king has power over the people. You can even see how the Senate has power to kind of check and balance the kings, or the consuls, rather. But what is not immediately apparent, and Polybius knows this, what isn't immediately apparent is what role the people have to play in all of this. If they are, if one of the fundamental things about the people is that besides voting, they just kind of are ruled, right? So here's what he says. He says, after all this, someone might reasonably wonder what role there is left for the people in this system of government, when the Senate is responsible for all the particulars I have mentioned, and most importantly manages all the state's revenues and expenses, this, like our Congress, holds the power of the purse, hypothetically, and the consuls have plenipotentiary power in the run-up to war and when out fighting campaigns. But the people do have a part to play, and a very important one at that, because they control rewards and punishments. There is no other provision within the Constitution for these functions, but without them, human life itself has no coherence. It's not just me telling you this, Polybius agrees with me, let alone governments and constitutions. For when the difference between better and worse is ignored, or when it is recognized but poorly managed, no business that is taken in hand turns out well. How could it, if the bad are honored no less than the good? So the people assess many of the cases where the penalty for the offense is a substantial fine, especially where the accused have held the highest offices, in all such cases where the penalty is death, and they assign offices to those who deserve them, which in a political context is the greatest possible reward for virtue. Then they are responsible for assessing legislation. Most importantly, it is they who decide whether or not to go to war, and they also either ratify or abrogate alliances, truces, and treaties. And again, all this means that it would be plausible to suggest that the people's role is paramount and that the Constitution is a democracy. So one of his themes is that if you look at each of these sections of the government in turn, you could almost think this is the most powerful one because they all have such a sort of finely calibrated amount of power. But the key here for us, right, is giving honors is the job and the responsibility and the privilege of the people, and it gives all life coherence. All the time I get asked, how do we fix things? How do we save our republic? What's my role? I'm just a common citizen. I'm just a everyday person. This is your job. Your job is to honor the good and to dishonor the bad, and to have that as a guiding light in your life, to always try to recognize virtue both publicly and privately, and to shame or to say or to denounce what is bad. The conferral of honor is what grants the people their power, it's what gives a republic coherence, and it's what the people essentially are there to do. It's just average folks like you and me who don't have political power, right? This is how we are supposed to exert a key influence in a republic. And Polybius argues that this is central to Rome's success. That, by the way, and cultural appropriation. I remember I argued in favor of cultural appropriation the other day. One of the things he says in chapter 25 is, the Romans are ready as anyone to adopt new practices and learn from others how to do things better. That's just a little aside. They were super into cultural appropriation. They were very good at it, just like us. It's part of what made them great. Now, more crucial, though, is that the Romans honored the right things. So here is where I'm going to read another portion of Polybius that is, again, central to this, leading into telling the story of Horatius Cocles. This is from chapter 52 onward in book 6. The Romans also have customs that hugely help to foster a spirit of bravery in their young men. One example will be enough to show how much trouble the state takes to produce men who will endure anything as long as it gains them a reputation among their fellow citizens for excellence. Whenever a notable Roman dies, as part of the funeral proceedings, he is carried in great splendor to the rostra, as they are called in the forum. Sometimes the body is recumbent, but more usually it is on display, sitting upright, with all the people standing around. Someone, an adult son, if there is one, and he happens to be there, or otherwise another family member, goes up to the rostra and delivers a speech in praise of the dead man's virtues and his exploits during his lifetime. This acts as a vivid reminder of the facts for the assembled people, whether or not they had been directly affected by his achievements, and they become so moved that the loss seems to be everyone's in common, not just a private family matter. Afterwards, once the body has been buried and the customary rites have been performed, they set up an icon of the dead man in the most conspicuous part of the house and enclose it in a wooden shrine. The icon consists of a mask that has been molded and made up to a remarkably exact likeness. On public holidays, they open up the shrines and carefully decorate the icons, and whenever a notable family member dies, they take them out for the funeral procession and put them on those who seem to bear the closest resemblance to the dead men in height and general appearance. This is kind of like, seems a little bit macabre to us, but it is central, Polybius says, to how Rome does things. Each masked man also dresses in the appropriate clothing and rides on a chariot, preceded by the staffs and axes, or whatever trappings are customary for the rank the ancestor had attained in his political career during his lifetime. It is hard to imagine a finer sight for an ambitious young man who aspires to excellence. Indeed, how could anyone remain unmoved by the sight of the arrayed icons, utterly lifelike, all of those famous heroes? What spectacle could be more wonderful than that? And then, once the person who delivers the encomium, the speech of praise of the man being buried, has finished speaking about him, he does the same for each of the ancestors who are represented there, starting with the most ancient, and describes their success. The most important thing is that young men are inspired to heroic feats of endurance for the common good in order to gain the glory that accrues to the brave. Now, this is, as I have said a number of times now, crucial. It's crucial to the functioning of the Roman state that there be what is called in Latin emulatio, and that's where we get our word emulation. It's this healthy competition, right, between different people to do better than one's peers and than one's ancestors, right? And finally, this is where we start to get into talking about Horatius Cocles. So there are many such stories in Rome featuring many individuals, but I will mention just one specific case, and that will be enough as an example to confirm what I have been saying. Horatius Cocles, the story goes, was fighting two of the enemy at the far end of the brigade across the Tiber that lies in front of Rome when he noticed a large body of men bearing down on him to join his opponents. Afraid that they might force the bridge and burst into the city, he turned to those behind him and shouted for them to fall straight away and cut the bridge. They did as he said. While the bridge was being destroyed, he stood his ground, despite taking many wounds, and checked the enemy onslaught. What his opponents found astonishing was not so much his physical strength as his grit and fearlessness. So, the bridge was demolished, and the enemy assault was foiled. Horatius then threw himself into the river in full armor. He deliberately sacrificed his life. The safety of Rome and subsequent fame were more important to him than his present existence and the years that remained to him. It seemed that the determination and will to perform noble deeds is ingrained that deeply in each successive generation by Rome's customs. So, This is why I chose to talk about Horatius today. It is the paradigmatic example of self-sacrifice inspired by honor and patriotism. It has been that ever since the story began being told. The whole episode is told in multiple sources, and it's different in various cases. In fact, it's not always the case that Horatius dies. Sometimes he just, puts himself in grave danger. But that idea of holding the bridge against an almost insurmountable, seemingly insurmountable force, that's the key to it, right? The whole thing is told in Livy in greater detail. Now, Livy, again, we've talked about before. We haven't really entered deeply into his work. We'll do a little bit more on him now. So Livy is a different guy than Polybius. He's not this soldier type. He's born in Padua, which is in northern Italy, 5964 BC, so a little later than Polybius. And he was a career writer. He was not a public official, which makes him distinct in Augustan Rome. He was in that Augustan period of flourishing that we talked about with Virgil as well. A lot of these guys were kind of muckamucks in the city. Virgil and Horace. But Livy, he wasn't in disfavor. He wasn't in exile. But he's this kind of rustic. He's a bit apart. He's no city slicker. And his prose, as his contemporaries were wont to note, his prose is kind of more down to earth. It's a little bit less polished in style. At the opening of his great history, and this is another one that's only comes to us partially. There are 142 books in total, but only 35 remain. He laments that the present day is just a mess. It's lost all of its republican virtue. But he says it will please me, at least, to look back on the days when we were virtuous, when we had civic virtue, when we were a republic. And again, it will be interesting and instructive to note what he says is a very famous preface, opening of his history, book 1. And he says, I shall find antiquity a rewarding study, if only because, while I am absorbed in it, I shall be able to turn my eyes from the troubles which for so long have tormented the modern world, and to write without any of that over-anxious consideration which may well plague a writer on contemporary life. Man, do I relate to Livy in this moment, even if it does not lead him to conceal the truth. Yeah. Most readers, a little bit earlier, most readers will take less pleasure in my account of how Rome began in her early history. But I enjoy looking back on this time when, he says, honors were attached to things like penury, to things like going without for the sake of the country. There was this sense that things were held in high esteem that were virtuous and good, and that is how, again, as Polybius says, that is how Rome was able to rise to her greatness. And ironically, in the way of the cycle of regimes, it was that very greatness that sort of began to unmake some of this spare, homespun virtue. But note the ambiguity in Livy's attitude, right? He later, in Book 2, at the beginning of Book 2, he says something remarkable which sort of speaks to some of the stuff that we've been talking about. So what happens in Rome, in the early history of Rome is under kings. Eventually, they kick their kings out because their kings become cruel and tyrannical, and so they exile their kings, and the republic begins. But Livy says something remarkable at the beginning of Book 2 about Rome's time under the kings. Here's what he says, beginning of Book 2. He says, one has but to think of what the populace was like in those early days, a rabble of vagrants, mostly runaways and refugees. This has to do with how Rome was founded and populated, and to ask what would have happened if they had suddenly found themselves protected from all authority by inviolable sanctuary and enjoying complete freedom of action, if not full political rights. In such circumstances, unrestrained by the power of the throne, they would, no doubt, have set sail on the stormy sea of democratic politics, swayed by the gusts of popular eloquence, and quarreling for power with the governing class of a city which did not even belong to them before any real sense of community had had time to grow. I've said this before. When we talked to Brandon, I talked about this, that there are conditions under which Republican liberty can flourish, and it's very hard to create those conditions if they don't already exist. Livy is actually glad that Rome was under virtuous kings for a time to shape their sense of themselves as a people, to shape their public rituals. It was very important under their second king, Numa Pompilius, was a big sort of mythic, legendary founder of all their religious rituals. And Polybius too says that's very important for social cohesion. And so Livy is actually saying, they were ready now for a republic, for representative government. These sorts of things, don't come naturally just to anyone sort of wandering around, and that's something I think to keep in mind, that we too, America too, our people were formed under a monarchy and rebelled only as subjects of a king, finding that it had come time for them to break the bonds of the tyranny that was extending across the sea. So something to keep in mind as we go. Now, here is the story then. Within that context, early republic, Rome begins to kind of have to defend itself against encroaching powers. It's always been warring with the people around. Rome has always been warring with the people around, foremost among them the Etruscans. And there are various different towns in Etruria, which is kind of this other rival power. They have long occupied the region in the northwest of Italy. And the Tarquin family, which is the family from which the last exiled king comes, is of Etruscan origin. And so when the kings are exiled, they basically team up. They go to Clusium, which is in Tuscany, where the city of Chiusi now is. They go and they ally with this king Lars Porsena. And here is where this battle begins. Lars Porsena basically makes an allegiance with the exiled king, and Clusium's a massive power, and their first assault is terrifying. They assemble outside of Rome. And it all comes down in the end to this bridge, the Pons Sublicius. And if they can pass that bridge and get over the Tiber, they will be in Rome and they will destroy it. And that is where Horatius comes in. So here's Livy's account of Horatius standing up against Lars Porsena and his army on the bridge, the Pons Sublicius. On the approach of the Etruscan army, the Romans abandoned their farmsteads and moved into the city. Garrisons were posted. In some sections of the city, walls seemed sufficient protection. In others, the barrier of the Tiber. The most vulnerable point was the wooden bridge, and the Etruscans would have crossed it and forced an entrance into the city had it not been for the courage of one man, Horatius Cocles, that great soldier whom the fortune of Rome gave to be her shield on that day of peril. Horatius was on guard at the bridge when the Ianiculum was captured by a sudden attack. The enemy forces came pouring down the hill, while the Roman troops, throwing away their weapons, were behaving more like an undisciplined rabble than a fighting force. Horatius acted promptly. As his routed comrades approached the bridge, he stopped as many as he could catch and compelled them to listen to him. "By God," he cried, "can't you see that if you desert your post, escape is hopeless? If you leave the bridge open in your rear, there will soon be more of them in the Palatine and the Capitol than on the Ianiculum." Urging them with all the power at his command to destroy the bridge by fire or steel or any means they could muster, he offered to hold up the Etruscan advance, so far as was possible, alone. Proudly, he took his stand at the outer end of the bridge, conspicuous among the rout of fugitives, sword and shield, ready for action. He prepared himself for close combat, one man against an army. The advancing enemy paused in sheer astonishment at such reckless courage. Man, Livy's amazing. He's so good. Two other men, Spurius Lartius and Titus Herminius, both aristocrats with a fine military record, were ashamed to leave Horatius alone. So there's another virtue, right? Brotherhood in arms. And with their support, he won through the first few minutes of desperate danger. Soon, however, he forced them to save themselves and leave him, for little was now left of the bridge, and the demolition squads were calling them back before it was too late. Once more, Horatius stood alone. With defiance in his eyes, he confronted the Etruscan chivalry, challenging one after another to single combat and mocking them all as tyrant slaves who, careless of their own liberty, were coming to destroy the liberty of others. For a while they hung back, each waiting for his neighbor to make the first move, until shame at the unequal battle drove them to action, and with a fierce cry they hurled their spears at the solitary figure which barred their way. Horatius caught the missiles on his shield and, resolute as ever, straddled the bridge and held his ground. The Etruscans moved forward and would have thrust him aside by the sheer weight of numbers, but their advance was suddenly checked by the crash of the falling bridge and the simultaneous shout of triumph from the Roman soldiers who had done their work in time. The Etruscans could only stare in bewilderment as Horatius, with a prayer to Father Tiber to bless him, and his sword plunged, fully armed, into the water and swam through the missiles which fell thick about him, safely to the other side where his friends were waiting to receive him. It was a noble piece of work, legendary maybe, but destined to be celebrated in story through the years to come. All right, this is a movie scene, right? I mean, this is just like so cool. And it's now this is important, right? Livy says, and he makes several comments to this effect, this is probably a legend. This is not exact history, and we can tell that because for a number of reasons. First of all, we can tell because there are different versions of it. Second of all, there are hints in other histories that actually what might have happened is Lars Porsena might have won this battle. He might have conquered Rome. Tacitus, who's another historian around 100 to 110 AD, writes in his Historiae, Book 3, Chapter 72, he mentions in passing that the city was surrendered to Lars Porsena. So there's some possibility that actually what happened is that the city was captured and they kind of rewrote the history to tell this story of this legend of this noble soldier. But one way or another, Horatius Cocles had a statue outside the Temple of Vulcan in Rome. And so note that the Romans themselves, right, Livy himself is quite open about this and aware that it may not be true. But the statue remains standing at least until Pliny the Elder in the 1st century AD mentions it in his Natural History, Book 34. He mentions it. When ancient records go this far back, we get contradictions. We get times when we're not quite sure how to parse what really did or did not happen. In general, I tend to be with I tend to think that modern historians are too skeptical of the knowledge that ancient historians actually have. Why should Tacitus be more right than Livy and Polybius? Not particularly sure, except that we want to believe the kind of skeptical thing that actually Lars conquered the city. But everybody is sort of aware that this is a legend. It's a good example of a story whose facts are hazy, but whose cultural significance is greater than just the facts. So the point of telling the story, the point of pointing to the statue, which again may not originally have been a statue of Horatius Cocles, but the point of pointing to it and telling this story and telling this legend of early Republican defense of Rome is to inspire others to go and do likewise. And so somebody like Scipio Africanus, whom I mentioned, who was very real and who did stand up against a massive enemy, those people would be inspired by stories like that. The conviction that they imparted and the noble feelings and passions that they imparted would lead them, would shape them into the kind of men that really could stand down massive armies. Back when we understood all of this, we too, in the modern West, used to tell the story of Horatius in exactly this way. And there is a great poem that I want to close with that recounts this. It's a poem by Thomas Babington Macaulay, 1842. He publishes Roman Lays, it's called, this book of Roman poems about Roman stories. And here's the stanza that everybody quotes. It's so good. It's about Horatius defending the bridge and defending Rome. He says, "Then outspake brave Horatius, the captain of the gate, to every man upon this earth death cometh soon or late, and how can man die better than facing fearful odds for the ashes of his fathers and the temples of his gods?" Now you see why I'm asking you, what do you honor? What do you hold in the highest possible esteem? And this is one of the things that is most under threat, is the ability to hold and honor the founders of our nation and the traditions which go back before our nation but inform the founding of our nation, right? All of these attacks, on that founding are currently themselves receiving honors, right? So, MacArthur Genius Grants go to Ta-Nehisi Coates, or National Book Awards to Ibram X. Kendi. These people, the Pulitzer Prize to Nicole Hannah-Jones. All these people who basically are out here writing that our country is evil. We'll never give Thomas Sowell or Larry Elder these, they basically remain unsung. And when you reward hatred of self and country, you create a country that is at war with itself. That's just, the sort of basic reality of how this works. I recently asked on Twitter, what was your radicalization moment, the moment that really made you, take note and realize that politics were a mess? And a surprising number of people said, I had to write a paper in college or in high school that I knew was wrong, but I knew the teacher agreed with it, so I would get an A. That is a broken system of honors that encourages conformity and dishonesty, and eventually people become very disillusioned with that. So your job today is to figure out what you honor and be bold about holding it in honor, about taking a moment to actually congratulate people and celebrate people that you think have real virtue. It is a practical thing that you can start doing as you hear my voice. Ask yourself what you honor and hold virtue in the highest esteem. We may yet win. All right, that's the end of this episode, except for the mailbag. So mailbag questions come to me on Twitter, and this is a really fun one. If you want to ask me a mailbag question, you should tweet at me, at Spencer Klavan, with the hashtag YoungHeretics. And this one is from at @M_Borgnine. I'm not sure how to pronounce that, Borgnine. I'm very much enjoying your podcast. Hey, thanks, man. So why is it called Young Heretics? You don't sound like a heretic. The opposite, in fact. This is funny because I get this question a lot. And actually, even I'm a little nervous whenever I want to call a guest an honorary heretic, because I'm afraid people, especially like, when I had Ted Cruz on, I had to ask him, I was like, is it okay if I call you an honorary heretic? He was fine with it. But the key is that it's not religious heresy at all. Quite to the contrary, as the person who asked the question indicated. I am not in any way trying to be a heretic, a Christian heretic. The word heresy is a Greek word, hairesis, meaning choice, meaning choosing a different path than the reigning doctrine. In the Catholic Church and the Christian Church more generally, this is a bad thing because the reigning doctrine is how the Church communicates its traditions and its values. And so heresy is condemned and anathematized. And of course, the history of that is complicated because many churches that we now go to, Protestant churches, would have been viewed as heretical when the Protestant Revolution and Reformation was occurring. It's a separate story for another day, but suffice it to say that heresy in and of itself, that is actual deviation from the truth of God, is not something toward which one aspires to. You don't get to choose, not to believe the truth of God. But in many other contexts, choosing something that is against the reigning doctrine can be an act of tremendous courage and virtue. And I believe that the reigning doctrine in elite circles, which are the circles of which I am a part, be it completely noted and conceded, I am an elite. I've grown up on the coasts. I, drink fancy scotch. I am, the child of a novelist, like all of these things. That class of people believes a certain set of things. They believe that nobody smart believes in God. They believe that borders are bad, that America is bad, fundamentally wrong, that, Western culture, to talk about it is chauvinist, all of those things. In that regard, I am a heretic, and I am inviting heresy from all my listeners from that orthodoxy. Choose something else. It is an act of great courage, and that's what this show is about. It's why I'm here to give you the classical education that you have been denied, because the denial comes from that orthodoxy, and we are the heretics. Thanks for joining the revolution. It's great to have you here. If you love this show, you will also love the Claremont Institute, which is full of other heretics, of the kind that I indicated, but not of religious heretics. The American Mind and the Claremont Review books are two publications. I write for them. I edit them. There are fabulous authors who also write there. And if you want to donate, go to claremont.org/donate and tell them that you heard about Claremont through Young Heretics. Really helps us. And, it's fun to bring home the bacon for my bosses. Okay. Thank you for being here. I will see you next time for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.